For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British royal family occupied a position unlike almost any other monarchy in the world. The crown was not simply a symbol of Britain itself. It was closely associated with an empire that stretched across continents, connecting Britain to territories in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and the Pacific. At the height of the imperial era, Britain possessed enormous global influence. British ships dominated major sea routes. London stood at the center of international finance, and British political and economic power reached far beyond the British Isles. The monarchy became one of the most visible symbols of that worldwide system. No royal figure represented this imperial age more clearly than Queen Victoria. When Victoria came to the throne in 1837, Britain was already an expanding imperial power. By the time of her death in 1901, the British Empire had grown enormously, and Victoria herself had become closely associated with Britain's imperial identity. In 1876, she was proclaimed Empress of India, giving her royal title a new significance within the empire. For the royal family, this was a world built around ceremony, hierarchy, tradition, and an extraordinary sense of permanence. The crown appeared to sit at the center of a system that had been expanding for generations, and there was little reason for many people living within that world to imagine that it could eventually disappear. But beneath the grandeur, the relationship between Britain and its empire was already becoming more complicated. Different parts of the empire were developing their own political institutions, national identities, and demands for greater self-government. Britain could still project enormous power, but the idea that one country could permanently control territories across the globe was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. That transformation would accelerate dramatically during the 20th century. The First World War would weaken the old European order. The Second World War would place enormous economic and political pressure on Britain. Across Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, nationalist movements would demand independence, and one British possession after another would move towards self-government. The royal family, however, would remain, and that is what makes Britain's story so different from the fall of many other imperial dynasties. The empire would gradually disappear, but the monarchy would not disappear with it. The real question, then, is not simply how Britain lost its empire. It is how a royal institution that had become so closely associated with imperial power managed to survive when the imperial world that had shaped it was transformed beyond recognition. For Britain, the decline of the empire did not begin with one dramatic defeat or a single announcement. It was a long process shaped by wars, political movements, economic pressure, and a growing realization that the old imperial system could not remain unchanged forever. The First World War was an early warning. Britain emerged on the winning side, but victory came at enormous financial and human cost. The old balance of power in Europe had been badly damaged, and Britain's ability to maintain its global position was no longer as unquestioned as it had been before 1914. At the same time, political movements across the empire were demanding greater control over their own affairs. India became one of the most important examples. The country was central to Britain's imperial system, yet Indian political leaders increasingly demanded self-government and, eventually, independence. Similar pressures were developing elsewhere. In the dominions such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State, local governments were becoming increasingly independent in practice, even while remaining connected to the British Crown. The empire was therefore changing from within long before most of its territory became formally independent. Then came the Second World War. Britain again emerged on the victorious side, but the cost was immense. The country was financially exhausted, heavily indebted, and facing a world that had changed dramatically during 6 years of war. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as the dominant global powers, while European empires increasingly faced movements demanding national independence. Britain could still call itself a great power, but maintaining a worldwide empire was becoming far more difficult. The decisive moment came in India. In 1947, British rule in India ended, and the territory was divided into the new states of India and Pakistan. The independence of India was not simply the loss of one possession, it was a powerful indication that the political structure of the British Empire was entering a completely different era. And this transformation would continue. During the following decades, countries across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere gained independence. Some transitions were relatively peaceful, others were accompanied by severe political conflict and violence. But the overall direction was unmistakable. The empire was being dismantled piece by piece. For the British monarchy, this created a completely new situation. The Crown had survived the First World War, the Second World War, and enormous political change. But the world that had once surrounded the monarchy was disappearing. And in 1952, when a young Princess Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II, she inherited a throne at precisely the moment when Britain's relationship with the rest of the world was being fundamentally rewritten. She would begin her reign as the monarch of a country that still possessed a vast overseas empire. But over the decades that followed, she would watch that empire become something very different. And the transformation was about to accelerate. When Elizabeth II became queen in 1952, Britain was still an imperial power. The map of the British Empire remained enormous, and the young monarch inherited a position that was still closely connected to Britain's global influence. But the world she was entering was already moving in a different direction. During the years that followed, one of the defining changes of Elizabeth's reign would be the transformation of Britain's relationship with its former colonies. Countries across Asia and Africa increasingly gained independence, and the empire that had once connected them to Britain gradually gave way to a looser association of independent nations. For Elizabeth, this was not simply something happening in distant capitals. It became part of the reality of her entire reign. In the early years, she continued to travel extensively throughout the Commonwealth and overseas territories. These visits helped give the monarchy a role in a changing international system. Instead of representing Britain as the unquestioned center of an empire, the Queen increasingly represented a relationship between independent countries with a shared historical connection. The distinction was important. The old empire had been based on British sovereignty over territories around the world. The emerging Commonwealth was fundamentally different. Its members were independent nations, and their relationship with the British Crown varied from country to country. As decolonization accelerated during the 1950s and 1960s, the change became impossible to ignore. Ghana became independent in 1957, Nigeria followed in 1960, and numerous other African territories achieved independence during the decade. Across the Caribbean and elsewhere, Britain continued to transfer political authority to newly independent governments. By the 1970s, the transformation was unmistakable. The empire that Elizabeth had inherited was no longer the defining reality of Britain's place in the world. Yet the monarchy remained. This was where Elizabeth II's reign became particularly significant. She did not attempt to preserve the old imperial system. Instead, the institution she represented increasingly operated within a post-imperial Britain. Her role became less about imperial authority and more about continuity, diplomacy, ceremony, and national identity. That shift did not happen overnight, and it was not without controversy. Britain's relationship with its colonial past would become increasingly debated, while attitudes toward the monarchy itself would continue to change. But the crown had managed something remarkable. It was moving from one historical age into another without disappearing altogether.
The young queen who inherited a throne connected to an enormous empire would eventually become the longest reigning British monarch in history, presiding over a country whose global role looked completely different from the one she inherited. And that transformation raises one of the central questions of her reign. How did Elizabeth II turn an empire-era monarchy into an institution capable of surviving the post-imperial world? By the second half of the 20th century, the British Empire had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Country after country became independent, and Britain was no longer the centre of a vast system of direct colonial rule. Yet something unexpected happened. The British Crown remained at the centre of Britain's public life. The key was adaptation. Instead of trying to preserve the old imperial structure, the monarchy increasingly became associated with the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent countries that shared historical connections with Britain but were no longer governed by it. Queen Elizabeth II played an important symbolic role in that transition. She became head of the Commonwealth, while members of the organization remained sovereign states with their own governments and political systems. That distinction allowed the monarchy to maintain an international presence without requiring Britain to control those countries. Royal tours became particularly important. Elizabeth II travelled extensively, meeting political leaders and local communities and appearing at events that emphasized cooperation rather than colonial administration. For millions of people, these visits became part of the public image of the modern monarchy. The Crown's influence was therefore changing. It was no longer primarily the influence of an imperial power. It was increasingly soft power, the ability to attract attention, build relationships, represent tradition, and create diplomatic goodwill without directly controlling another government. This transformation also helped the royal family remain visible on a global scale. The monarchy could participate in state occasions, welcome foreign leaders, travel abroad, and represent Britain internationally, even as Britain's actual political and economic power was no longer comparable to the height of the imperial era. But this new role came with a challenge. The monarchy now had to justify its relevance in a world where inherited status was increasingly questioned. Britain was becoming more socially diverse, less deferential, and more skeptical of traditional institutions. The Crown could no longer rely simply on the prestige of empire. It needed a different relationship with the public. Elizabeth II's approach was largely based on continuity and duty. Her long reign gave the monarchy a sense of stability while governments changed, social attitudes evolved, and Britain's position in the world continued to shift. But stability alone could not protect the institution from criticism. The royal family was entering a new kind of struggle, one that had little to do with armies or territories. It was a struggle for public confidence and relevance. Television, newspapers, and eventually the internet would bring the private lives of royals into millions of homes. Personal relationships, family disagreements, marriages, and scandals could become national stories within hours. And one member of the family would soon transform that relationship between the monarchy and the public more dramatically than almost anyone else. Her name was Diana, Princess of Wales. Her arrival would bring the royal family closer to the public than ever before, but it would also expose just how difficult it could be for a centuries-old institution to survive in the age of mass media. By the late 20th century, the British monarchy was no longer dealing with the challenges that had defined the imperial era. Britain was no longer governing a vast overseas empire, and the Crown's international role had changed dramatically. The new challenge was much closer to home. Could the royal family remain relevant to a public whose attitudes toward tradition,
class, and authority were changing rapidly. Television played a major role in that transformation. Royal events that had once been experienced mainly through newspapers and photographs could now be watched by millions of people. The monarchy became more visible than ever, but greater visibility came with a price. The public was no longer seeing only carefully managed ceremonies. Increasingly, they were seeing the personalities, relationships, disagreements, and difficulties behind the institution. Then came Diana, Princess of Wales. Her marriage to Prince Charles in 1981 created enormous public excitement. Diana quickly became one of the most recognizable people in the world, attracting extraordinary media attention and developing a public image that often seemed more accessible and emotionally expressive than the traditional image of royalty. Her popularity could benefit the monarchy, but it also created tension. The more intensely the media followed Diana's life, the more difficult it became to separate the private lives of members of the royal family from their public responsibilities. The breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage became a major national and international story. By the 1990s, the monarchy was facing intense scrutiny over its finances, family relationships, and ability to adapt to modern expectations. Then, in 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. Her death produced an extraordinary public reaction and placed the monarchy under enormous pressure. Many people felt that the royal family had appeared distant at a moment when the public was grieving. The institution was forced to confront a difficult reality. Traditional royal restraint did not always match the emotional expectations of a modern audience. Queen Elizabeth II ultimately adjusted the monarchy's public response, while the family continued its transition into a more media-conscious institution. The lesson was significant. The crown could no longer survive simply because of history. It had to understand how the public viewed it. That did not mean abandoning tradition. Instead, the monarchy increasingly tried to combine tradition with greater visibility, public engagement, and a clearer emphasis on service. The challenge was no longer maintaining an empire. It was maintaining relevance in a society that no longer automatically respected institutions simply because they were old. And this challenge would become even more important as Elizabeth II's reign entered its final decades, because the monarchy would eventually have to prepare for a future without the person who had become its most familiar face. By the beginning of the 21st century, the transformation of the British monarchy was almost complete. The institution that had once been closely associated with imperial power now occupied a very different position. Britain was no longer an imperial superpower, and the countries that had once formed the British Empire were independent states. Yet the crown remained an important part of British public life. This survival was not accidental. Over the course of Elizabeth II's reign, the monarchy had gradually shifted away from the idea of imperial authority and toward a role built around constitutional tradition, national identity, diplomacy, and public service. The Commonwealth became an important part of that transition. Although it had historical roots in the British Empire, it was not an empire in the old sense. Its member countries were independent, and the organization provided a framework through which Britain could maintain relationships with countries that had once been under British rule. For Elizabeth II, the Commonwealth also became one of the defining international aspects of her reign. Her visits to member countries allowed her to maintain personal relationships with political leaders and communities across a rapidly changing world. The symbolism mattered because the monarchy was no longer representing Britain as the ruler of an expanding imperial system. It was representing a historical connection that had survived the end of colonial rule. Inside Britain, the Crown's role was changing as well. The Queen's constitutional position remained largely ceremonial, while elected governments exercised political power. Her importance increasingly came from continuity. Governments changed, prime ministers came and went, and British society transformed dramatically, but the monarch remained a constant presence. That continuity became particularly powerful during Elizabeth II's extraordinarily long reign. She served under 15 British prime ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, and witnessed enormous changes in technology, culture, politics, and Britain's place in the world. But continuity did not mean that the monarchy was immune to criticism. Questions about the cost of the royal family, its privileges, its connection to Britain's colonial past, and its future continued to generate debate. Younger generations often viewed the institution differently from previous generations, and the monarchy had to operate in a society far less deferential toward inherited status. That tension became even more significant when Elizabeth II died in September 2022. After 70 years on the throne, Britain suddenly had a new monarch. King Charles III inherited an institution that was no longer the imperial monarchy of his ancestors.
He inherited a constitutional monarchy operating in a modern, diverse, and increasingly skeptical society. His challenge was therefore very different from that faced by earlier kings. He did not inherit an empire to manage. He inherited a monarchy that had survived the empire. And that distinction is essential to understanding the modern British crown. The institution's greatest achievement was no longer expansion, it was adaptation. The question now was whether that adaptation could continue into another generation. By the time Elizabeth II died in 2022, the world she had inherited 70 years earlier had almost completely disappeared. When she became queen, Britain still possessed a substantial empire. When her reign ended, that empire had become history, while the monarchy remained one of the country's most recognizable institutions. That contrast is what makes the British royal family's story so unusual. The monarchy did not survive by keeping the old imperial system alive. It survived by changing its role as Britain itself changed. The crown moved from being closely associated with imperial authority to becoming primarily a constitutional and ceremonial institution, while the Commonwealth provided a new framework for relationships with many countries that had once been part of the British Empire. Elizabeth II was central to that transformation because her reign lasted long enough to span both worlds. She inherited an empire-era monarchy, but she spent most of her life representing a post-imperial Britain. Her public role increasingly centered on continuity, national occasions, diplomacy, and service rather than direct political influence. But survival should not be confused with universal acceptance. The monarchy continues to face questions about its cost, its privileges, its relevance, and Britain's complicated relationship with its imperial past. The fact that an institution has survived does not mean that every generation sees it in the same way. King Charles III now represents the next stage of that story. His reign began in a Britain that is very different from the country ruled by Queen Victoria, or even the country Elizabeth II inherited in 1952. The United Kingdom is no longer an imperial centre. British society is more diverse, and public expectations of institutions have changed dramatically. That means the future of the monarchy depends on something that has defined its modern history: adaptation. The British royal family once stood at the centre of a global empire whose reach stretched across continents. That empire gradually disappeared through independence movements, political change, wars, and the transformation of the international system. The crown remained because its role changed with the world around it, and perhaps that is the most important lesson in the entire story. The remarkable thing is not simply that Britain once ruled an enormous empire. It is that the monarchy managed to remain after that empire was gone, even though so much of the world that had surrounded it had changed. The palaces are still there,
The ceremonies continue. The crown still exists. But its meaning is no longer the same. It represents a different Britain, operating in a different world, under a completely different set of expectations.
And that is how Britain's royal family survived the end of the empire. Not by preserving the past, but by learning how to exist without it.